Hello everyone, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. How are you guys doing today? If you'll recall from last time that we talked about the Battle of Hamburger Hill, which took place in 1969 during the later part of the Vietnam War, well, today I want to shift our focus a little bit back to World War II, because this week is a very significant week in that it marks the 78th anniversary of the iconic Battle of Midway, which took place in 1942 in the Pacific. Now, a lot of people would consider Midway to be the most iconic naval battle of all time. In fact, it's probably considered to be one of the most significant battles ever in U.S. military history. Now, the Battle of Midway holds a personal touch to me because I actually have a family on my mom's side of the family who actually served in the Pacific during World War II. In fact, his ship almost ended up participating in the Battle of Midway. This veteran that I'm talking about, William/Bill Chase, he's also a Pearl Harbor survivor and is among one of the last living survivors of the initial attack by the Japanese that brought us into World War II. I had the opportunity to interview this individual a few years ago while I was still in college. I mean, you sit down with this guy and he has such a photographic memory that he could recall everything from the wreckage of the ships from Pearl Harbor all the way to the details of his ship that he served on his whole time in the Navy and during that crucial time that the Battle of Midway took place. I mean, it's very rare that and so unfortunate that our World War II veterans are passing away as much as they are. So this video goes out to all those World War II veterans who put their lives on the line to protect our freedoms. Anyway, to circle back to Midway, so the Battle of Midway, to many people, is considered to be the first major naval battle, or battle in general, that took place in the Pacific theater of World War II, following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So I know what a lot of you are thinking. What was so important about Midway altogether? Well, that's what we're going to dive into today, as well as how the battle panned out for both sides of the battle. So, like I said, the Battle of Midway took place between June 3rd and June 7th, 1942, and the reasons behind it was basically the commander of the Japanese Navy at the time, Admiral Yamamoto, realized that after the initial bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, that the initial goal of that attack was not met at all, which was basically to wipe out the entire U.S. Navy fleet so that they couldn't compete against the Japanese Navy. Now, the main target in the Pearl Harbor attack was to take out all of our U.S. Navy carriers so our planes couldn't go out to the islands and attack Japanese fortifications and all that good stuff. So, a month later, after Pearl Harbor ended on January 14th, 1942, Yamamoto submits an idea, or he comes up with this idea, to attack the island of Midway, which is roughly about 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. And it was, at the time, an American base for all of our naval operations in the Pacific, so he knew that if the Japanese were to attack that particular island in the Pacific, it would somehow open the floodgates for the Japanese to come in and annihilate what was left of the U.S. Navy after that attack at Pearl Harbor. In the back of his mind, his idea was that he basically wanted to annihilate the whole rest of the U.S. Navy that survived the Pearl Harbor attack so that the Japanese Navy and forces would dominate everything in the Pacific. And not only that, but he also felt like if he would annihilate all the U.S. Pacific Fleet at one particular spot, that the Americans would feel compelled to come to a short end to the war and negotiate a treaty with the Axis powers. Even though Yamamoto's plan of taking over Midway Island felt really good in his mind and on paper, there was quite a bit of resentment to the idea originally from other members of the Japanese Navy. I mean, they almost took it upon themselves to do anything to make sure that the plan wouldn't go through and be approved whenever it was first admitted on April 2nd, 1942. However, after a few days of heavy debate and going back and forth, they finally decided to approve Yamamoto's plan of the invasion of Midway on April 5th, 1942. So, after the plan gets approved by the other members of the Japanese Navy, Yamamoto seeks the opportunity to really put his plan into action. So, the very first step was to create a diversionary force on the small air base at Dutch Harbor, Unalaska, as well as bring Japanese troops to seize the islands of Attu and Kiska. Now, while all of this is going on and Yamamoto thinks, oh, this is going to be the perfect plan ever to annihilate the enemy, our Admiral of the U.S. Navy, Chester Nimitz, who was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, he received imminent warnings of an attack on Midway from Lieutenant Commissioner Joseph J. Rochford, whose cryptanalysis had entered the Japanese Navy's communications system. Knowing that the Aleutians would be considered a decoy, Nimitz concentrated his 3 carriers where needed around Midway, misinformed the Japanese as to their location. After the diversionary attack of the Japanese fleet, a group of US B-17 bombers flew from Midway to meet the invasion force, which they mistakenly thought was the main Japanese fleet. This particular part of the battle marked the first phase of the battle, which was unsuccessful for us because after that they knew that that was a Japanese decoy. Now, the actual heavy fighting of the battle actually starts early morning on June 4th. That is whenever Vice Admiral Nagumo, who was the commander of 4 of Japanese most prominent aircraft carriers, began his attack on Midway. Now, simultaneously, Midway-based U.S. aircraft attacked his ships, but none of them gained any advantage whatsoever. In fact, most of them were gunned down before they could do any damage. The Japanese aircraft that had attacked Midway returned, needing to land on deck, and 3 U.S. dive bomber squadrons, 1 from the Yorktown and 2 from the Enterprise, arrived over the Japanese fleet. Now, these dive bombers, they were able to destroy 3 of the 4 carriers under his command, which included the Kaga, the Akagi, and the Soryu. Now, the one surviving Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, survived long enough for the planes to hit the Yorktown. Then she too sank under attack from the Yorktown and the Enterprise. Now, meanwhile, a wave of U.S. Devastator torpedo bombers from the U.S. carriers of the Hornet and the Enterprise arrived to attack any remaining Japanese ships. Now, they were unescorted by bomber planes, and because of that, nearly all of them were shot down by Japanese Zero fighters. Although the major fighting of the Battle of Midway occurred on June 4th, 1942, there were still elements of Japanese ships and soldiers out there, and the U.S. continued to fight all of these forces for the next 2 days. In response to the 3 carriers being sunk by the U.S., the one surviving Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launched 2 waves of attacks on the Yorktown, which had been abandoned, but it still remained afloat because it was so damaged and everything. Now, U.S. dive bombers from all 3 carriers returned to attack the Hiryu and set it ablaze. That put all of the Japanese carriers out of commission for the rest of the battle. Now, the destroyer, the USS Hayman, provided cover for the disabled carrier, the Yorktown, during salvage operations. But a Japanese submarine arrived on June 6 and launched 4 torpedoes that struck both of the ships. Now, the Hayman sank in a couple of minutes, but the Yorktown barely stayed afloat, but later on that day it would totally sink whatsoever. So, after all this harsh fighting between fighter pilots and their carriers and everything, on June 6, Yamamoto orders most of his forces to retreat from Midway whatsoever in defeat. And so, in all, it's fairly accurate to say that the Japanese suffered a lot more losses than the Americans, but overall it was a very costly war for both sides of the conflict. Now, the Japanese ended up losing 3,000 of their men, which included nearly 200 very skilled aviators during the battle. And on top of those 3,000 men, they lost almost 300 aircraft, 1 heavy cruiser, and of course all 4 of their aircraft carriers in the battle. Now, for comparison's sake, the U.S. forces suffered way less damage and casualties compared to the enemy. Now, the Americans lost, of course, the USS Yorktown and Hammond, and around 150 of their own aircraft, and approximately 360 servicemen. I know even those numbers sound like a lot, but when you put them side by side, the Japanese lost way more men and resources than we ever did. And basically, the Japanese underestimated the force of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps and their pilots as they were fighting in the battle. So, what is the significance of Midway altogether? Well, basically, Midway proved to Japan that the U.S. was a force that they shouldn't reckon with whatsoever, and that the morale among American troops were so high that they were more than determined to do anything to beat the Japanese. And sort of a revenge-esque kind of feel due to what happened on December 7th, 1941. But what was the major outcome of the Battle of Midway? Well, I guess you could call it a climax in that particular theater of World War II, because not only did the U.S. Navy single-handedly cause humiliation on the Japanese, but it also proved to the Japanese that Americans would stop at nothing to achieve what they set out for, and they used different tactics than what the Japanese were used to altogether. Basically, after this crushing defeat, the Japanese were not the same. Thus, this is where all the island hopping campaign starts in World War II, because after this battle ends in June 1942, you start having Marine Corps forces invading all these islands to slowly island hop their way toward the mainland of Japan. And the first major battle after this one was at the Battle of Guadalcanal. And the Battle of Guadalcanal was the very first time that Marine Corps forces would face offenses against the Japanese. Now, granted, the war in the Pacific would last a little more than 3 years from that point in time, but let's just say that the Pacific was a very hard-won theater for the U.S., and it toughened Marine and Army and Navy, all the branches of the military forces that participated in that theater during World War II. So basically, Midway was a stepping stone and layout for the rest of the war and how it was going to go in favor of the U.S. So thank you guys very much for tuning in to this latest episode. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a like or a comment down below. And if you happen to know anybody who's a veteran, not just from World War II, but also all the other wars, I would really love to get their story and really sit down and talk with them and film it for them and their families. So, as always, thank you guys so very much for tuning in, and please stay tuned in for next time. Thank you guys, and have a great one.